early human societies were not societies of gigantic empires and civilizations with masters and slaves and so on and so forth. They were small groupings of people, starting out in Africa and then eventually spreading to other parts of the world, who lived largely by gathering and hunting, mainly by gathering. Despite all the alpha male mythology about the great hunter and so on, especially in the early days, hunting was a very uncertain enterprise. Often you didn't get anything, or if you were lucky, you found the remains of an animal that another animal had killed, and you took that back and distributed it among the people in your community. And every once in a while, you really got on top of things, and maybe you got a few animals and you brought those back. But mainly, the livelihood of the people was done by the gathering of what was at hand in the area over which people ranged, the fruits and other nuts and other things people could eat. It was more of a very simple hand-to-mouth existence, more or less. And there was a certain division of labor within this. The men, yes, were the ones who mainly went out and did the hunting, and the women did more of the gathering, because they had to stay more in the area of where the people were living at the time. Why? Well, if you think about it for a second, the answer will suggest itself. Obviously, the women are the ones who bore and who mainly had responsibility for raising the children, especially in their early years. Think about it. There was no birth control, as we certainly no consistent birth control, no family planning in that sense, no formula, all these kind of things. So babies came when they came, and they had to be nursed for a couple of years. So naturally, it fell to the women to do that, and as a result, this division of labor developed where they stayed more around the home and did the gathering. But it's important to emphasize this was not an oppressive division. The communities were more or less marked by equality. I say more or less, it wasn't a perfect equality. But women as well as men took part in the decision making. Marriages and sexual relations were very relaxed, formed by mutual consent more or less, and either partner could break up, if there were a pair, could break it up, or people didn't pair in the way we're familiar with. They might have had several partners, each of them, that they were paired with. So all the things that we're familiar with and are told are just the natural order of things. God decreed that the family is one man and one woman. Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. All that stuff is just a function of how society has developed since these early communities. So this early division was not oppressive, but it was a division. And through, once again, a lot of accident and necessity, trial and error, in some parts of the world, particularly in Eurasia, the part that's Europe and the Middle East more or less, for a variety of reasons, out of need and out of innovation, people, instead of just gathering, started settling down and farming. And sometimes they failed at it. But where they succeeded, they were able to produce a lot more food than they needed at a given time after a certain period of experimenting with this. They could put aside a surplus for the future. They didn't just live literally hand to mouth. And they also domesticated animals. You can read some about this in Jared Diamond's Germs, Guns, and Steel. They domesticated animals. They began to develop another division of labor, where on the basis of there being a surplus of farming, because when you're farming, you just don't take what's there. You transform the soil, and you can make it richer, and it can produce more than what you would need at a given time. So on that basis, you could have some people who didn't have to farm, and they would work on developing implements and tools to increase the farming and the other activity of the people and get an even bigger yield and more surplus. And the domestication of animals went along with this, where the animals were available and could be domesticated, particularly in this Eurasian area. They were also harnessed to till the soil, which made it even more rich, fertile, and productive. But along with this, as this took hold in various places, it broke down the old communal society and ways of doing things, and the old relations, more or less, of communal equality. Now let me make clear here. I do not believe, and I don't think there's a scientific basis to say, that even if you could show that in the earliest communal societies there were all kinds of relations of exploitation and oppression, that would somehow prove that it wouldn't be possible to move beyond this in the period in which we exist now, because this is a very different world. And it doesn't prove there's some inherent, unchangeable and unchanging human nature that makes people selfish and want to oppress and exploit other people. But by and large, these early communities were not marked by the oppression and exploitation and divisions that we're all familiar with, except when they encountered other community groups that were alien to them, and often they didn't know how to resolve things or fit each other in, and so there were conflicts, including violent conflicts between these groups sometimes. It's interesting, if you look at the early societies that are still more or less have been perpetuated down to the present, you will find that if you inquire how do the people in those societies or communities or tribes or peoples refer to themselves, very often they don't use this or that name that you might think they'd use. They just refer to themselves in what translates into English as the people. And this is very common in all parts of the world. So what happens when you, the people, meet the people, and you can't figure out who's the real people and how to relate? Well, you might get, you have different mythology, different history, so you might have violent conflicts. Not always, but there were at times. But as this farming and the division of labor and the domestication of animals and the development of surplus took hold, it began to break down these communal societies. You got the emergence of private property, private ownership of parcels of land, private ownership of the domesticated animals, private ownership of the tools that were being developed. And along with this, you got an oppressive division emerging between the sexes or the genders, because with this division of labor that had carried over from very early days, the women were still the ones mainly responsible for the bearing and rearing of children. So it more and more fell to the men to be the ones organizing the farming and related activity. And they, on this basis, appropriated the means of production, the land, the raw materials that might be under the land, the farm animals that had been domesticated, the tools, as their private property. And as they did that over time, they wanted to be able to pass this private property to their heirs, in particular their male heirs. So then they became concerned to control the activity of women, and in particular the sexual activity of women, because you wanted to be sure that the male heirs that you were passing it on to were your own and not somebody else's. Now, I have to say they did have a problem here, because while the women were tightly controlled and not allowed to sleep with anybody else, the men went around and did it anyway. So then you got a problem. Well, if the men are sleeping with people other than their wives, how do you know whose children are really whose? So they just instituted over, again, trial and error, not somebody sat down and wrote out a piece of paper. But trial and error, they simply instituted that whoever the woman's children were, those were the children of her husband. But still, the husband wanted to have a better chance of knowing they were really his own children he's passing these things on to. So he was concerned, and men got together to enforce the control over the sexuality and other activity of women. And this has been carried forward from that time through different forms of society, which have been divided into oppressors and oppressed, exploited and exploited, exploiters and exploited, masters and slaves. And that brings up the next point, that once you started having this way of life as opposed to the old communal way, then instead of when you had encounters with other people from other tribes or groups or whatever, instead of just killing them if there were a violent conflict, it made a certain amount of sense economically to take them as slaves, because now you could put them to work in agriculture and other forms of activity that would help create even more surplus than you would have to spend maintaining them. So women were one of the first groups enslaved in this way, but also people involved in conflicts among the different groups. And so down through a whole period of thousands of years since this time, we've had the evolution of the kind of societies we've had, marked by the division into exploiters and exploited, oppressors and oppressed, masters and slaves.